A fateful Christmas day in America. On the morning of December 25th, snow covered the rooftops and lawns of Boulder, Colorado, transforming the entire city into a picturesque winter wonderland. The sharp, crisp air was filled with the faint sound of holiday music drifting through open windows and chimneys exhaling smoke into the pale sky. All across the Rocky Mountain foothills, children were already awake, tearing through wrapping paper and squealing with joy, while adults sipped coffee and exchanged sleepy smiles, grateful for a rare moment of peace. The Peterson family's classic American home sat on a quiet street lined with frosted trees and glowing with the warmth of decorative lights carefully strung along the porch. The scent of pine needles and cinnamon drifted through the air as Sandra Peterson placed homemade cinnamon rolls on the kitchen table, the radio playing Bing Crosby's White Christmas softly in the background. It was the kind of morning that seemed to promise nothing but simple happiness. Stockings hung on the mantel, gifts piled high beneath a perfectly trimmed Christmas tree, and laughter echoing up the stairs. As the sun rose, Richard Peterson stood at the front window, coffee mug in hand, watching neighbors greet one another with hearty waves and shouts of "Merry Christmas!" Even the family's golden retriever, Max, sensed the significance of the day, wagging his tail as he circled the legs of little Amy and Ben, both still in their festive pajamas. They had spent weeks writing wish lists to Santa, studying the catalogs that arrived in the mail, and counted down to Christmas with an excitement only childhood can bring. The city of Boulder seemed to exist in a bubble that morning, insulated from the larger world's troubles, awash in comfort and tradition. For a few precious hours everyone forgot the endless demands of work and school, and the Petersons promised one another that for this day at least, they would put aside their worries and phone notifications, and simply be a family. They planned to ice skate at the city rink after lunch, then visit neighbors for an evening potluck. There were even rumors that a soft late-afternoon snow might fall, the kind that sparkled under street lamps and added a magical finishing touch to an already enchanting holiday. None of them could have foreseen that this idyllic scene, so ordinary and so perfect in its American simplicity, would fracture before the next dawn, and that the Peterson home would soon become the focus of a tragedy that would horrify a nation. In that moment, though, the world outside could wait. Inside the house, all that existed was togetherness, warmth, and the joyful chaos of a family Christmas. The all-American family, and their path to success. The Petersons stood as the quintessential American family, an embodiment of the values, aspirations, and triumphs that filled local folklore in their Boulder, Colorado community. Richard Peterson, at 53, was the very picture of ambition fulfilled. He was not only the president and CEO of a rapidly growing technology firm in downtown Denver, but also the self-made son of Midwestern farmers who had worked his way up, first as an ambitious college student, then as a tenacious junior associate, barely scraping by. Through tireless hours, moments of doubt, and a sharp business acumen, Richard had built a career that made him a respected figure both in boardrooms and at the neighborhood barbecues. He was known for his calm, analytical demeanor and his dedication to both his profession and his family, a delicate balancing act that so many admired yet few truly mastered. Beside him was Sandra Peterson, 40, whose radiant presence in the community extended far beyond her role as a homemaker. Sandra had once graced the stage as Miss West Virginia in her 20s, a crown earned through not just her beauty, but also her intelligence and focus. After marrying Richard, she traded spotlights and sachets for PTA meetings and artfully orchestrated holiday dinners, but her sense of elegance never faded. Instead, she turned her energy into building a warm, nurturing home that became the heart of neighborhood activity. Sandra was the mother every child adored, always quick to volunteer, organize, and offer a hot meal to a neighbor in need. Her background as a pageant queen only heightened her allure, but those who knew her best prized her quick wit and approachable kindness. Their children, Ben and Amy, rounded out this picture-perfect tableau. 9-year-old Ben, curious and clever beyond his years, was often absorbed in building elaborate models or conducting science experiments with his father on the weekends. His teachers raved about his natural aptitude for math and his easygoing sense of humor. Amy, at 6, charmed everyone with her sparkling blue eyes and infectious laugh. She was her mother's shadow, mimicking Sandra's grace during impromptu living room fashion shows or when carefully icing cupcakes for school bake sales. Both children were frequently seen in matching outfits at church events or riding their bikes through the tree-lined streets, their joy contagious to all who crossed their path. Despite their outward success, The Petersons strove for something deeper than material achievement or public praise. Family traditions and shared experience anchored their lives. The Sunday pancakes, the annual cross-country camping trips, and the handwritten notes tucked into school lunches. They cultivated gratitude for the privileges they enjoyed, instilling empathy and humility in Ben and Amy. Yet their affluence was undeniable. Elegant cars in the driveway, a spacious two-story brick home, and the best opportunities for their children, from music lessons to private tutors as needed. Still, their warmth ran deeper than their wealth. Friends described their home as a place filled with laughter, music, and a welcoming spirit that never discriminated. In Boulder's close-knit society, the Petersons were celebrated as proof that the traditional American dream, success earned through hard work, integrity, and love, was alive and well. Their lives seemed touched by fortune and diligence alike. No one could have guessed that behind this perfect image, fate was quietly setting events in motion that would challenge everything they believed about safety, trust, and the bonds of family. The beautiful daughter in the spotlight. Amy Peterson had a special radiance that seemed to set her apart from other children her age, even in the most crowded room. The youngest member of the Peterson family, she was just 6 years old, but her presence was unmistakable. With golden curls tumbling over her shoulders, bright sapphire eyes that absorbed every nuance around her, and rosy cheeks that seemed to glow with a perpetual sense of wonder, Amy carried with her a spark that delighted everyone she met. From the earliest days of preschool, Amy displayed a rare combination of confidence and charm. While other children might have shied away from attention, Amy flourished beneath it. Whether it was a backyard birthday celebration or a school music recital, she seemed drawn to the stage as if she'd been made for the limelight. It was Sandra, her mother, who first noticed Amy's aptitude for performing. Having herself been crowned Miss West Virginia years before, Sandra recognized the subtle poise and innate grace that set Amy apart. Encouraged by her mother's gentle guidance and with a wardrobe full of homemade costumes and sparkling tiaras, Amy began entering local children's beauty pageants. It wasn't long before the Peterson family living room overflowed with trophies, sashes, and photographs capturing Amy's beaming smile. At regional competitions, judges were captivated by her blend of genuine innocence and practiced composure. Amy would twirl on stage in sequined dresses her mother had tailored by hand, and answer questions with an unfiltered candor that won over audiences. Her rendition of classic holiday songs or her bright, confident delivery during interview segments quickly made her a crowd favorite. The attention Amy received rippled far beyond the pageant circuit. Local newspapers regularly ran features about her achievements, and she was often invited to perform at community events or church concerts. Neighbors eagerly watched for her latest performance or congratulated her at the grocery store. She had even appeared in several local commercials, lending her bright smile to everything from holiday toys to children's clothing boutiques. In the eyes of Boulder's families, Amy was the cherished little star of their community, a symbol of possibility, joy, and wholesome aspiration. Yet behind the glamour and accolades, those closest to Amy saw a thoughtful, gentle-spirited girl who loved her dolls, spent afternoons drawing crayon portraits, and was never happier than when baking cookies or curling up to read storybooks with her mother. Despite the demanding rehearsal schedules and weekends spent on the road, Sandra and Richard Peterson worked hard to preserve Amy's sense of innocence, reminding her that kindness, curiosity, and empathy mattered more than any trophy. Amy's brother Ben, at 9, sometimes found the spotlight on his sister overwhelming. Still, he often served as her biggest supporter, cheering quietly from the audience, building elaborate sets for her talent shows, or sneaking her good luck notes before competitions. Their sibling bond, though occasionally strained by the intensity of Amy's schedule, remained rooted in shared laughter, mischief, and the comfort of family traditions. By the winter of 1996, Amy's reputation as a young pageant star had only grown. Strangers sometimes recognized her during errands around town, and her collection of ribbons and medals seemed destined to multiply with every passing year. The Petersons could hardly have imagined that the light surrounding their little star would come under such darkness, or that the adoration of a city could turn almost overnight into a nationwide obsession with tragedy and justice. Christmas party night and the beginning of a tragic drama. The evening of December 25th arrived with a sense of fulfillment, the Peterson household aglow after a day of warmth, laughter, and celebration. This year the family had received an invitation from close friends to attend the annual Christmas gathering at the Winthrop residence. a tradition in Boulder's tight-knit community that no one wanted to miss. Bundling up against the deepening chill, Richard, Sandra, Ben and Amy headed out, their house momentarily left to the silent guardianship of holiday decorations and twinkling string lights. Inside the Winthrop home, the air was alive with the crackle of a fireside, the sounds of Christmas carols, and the comforting fragrance of roast turkey and mulled cider. The children darted between clusters of adults, comparing gifts and orchestrating impromptu games, their excitement punctuating every corner. Parents mingled, trading stories from the past year, while couples found corners to reminisce over glasses of eggnog. For the Petersons, this evening represented more than mere festivity. It was their chance to reaffirm bonds with old friends, to watch Amy revel in the spotlight as the unofficial darling of the party, and to relish a few precious hours away from the relentless pace of their typical routines. As the sky outside faded from sapphire to inky black, an unusual hush settled across the party. Snow had begun to fall once again, large flakes spinning down in windless spirals, making the world outside seem softer, more distant. Guests huddled together for goodbye snapshots, last nibbles of cookies, and perhaps just a minute longer basking in the glow of contentment. At last, Richard thanked their hosts, bundled his family into their SUV, and drove carefully through glistening, deserted streets back toward their own home. A sense of utter normality pervaded the drive, everyone exhausted yet sated, happiness whispering them toward deep and dreamless rest. When the Petersons arrived home, each retreated to familiar rhythms. Sandra checked the kitchen one last time to tidy away dishes. Richard locked up and set the home alarm. Ben mumbled a sleepy goodnight before trudging to his room, and Amy, still beaming with the afterglow of the evening, fluttered down the hall in her velvet dress. They gathered briefly at the foot of the staircase, one more Merry Christmas exchanged, a goodnight hug, the promise of adventures yet to come the following morning. Soon, the warm house grew quiet, shadows lengthened against the walls and snowfall cloaked the streets in a plush silence. No one in the Peterson family, nor anyone in Boulder that peaceful night, could have known that even as they surrendered to sleep and the comfort of routine, the first nearly imperceptible notes of a tragedy were already playing out. In the stillness, fate was on the verge of upending both the safety of their home and the innocence of their small mountain city forever. The ransom note and the morning shock. At precisely 4:45 a.m. on December 26th, while the rest of Boulder was still deep in post-holiday slumber, Sandra Peterson quietly rose from bed, her mind already filled with plans for the day ahead. The aroma of yesterday's cinnamon rolls lingered as she padded through the dimly lit hallway and descended the staircase toward the kitchen. The house was still, every room blanketed in the gentle silence that follows a long, joyous family gathering, until her gaze fell upon something completely out of place. Resting conspicuously on a middle stair was a white envelope, not one of the cheerful Christmas cards exchanged hours earlier, but something far more unsettling. Hesitation pricked at her nerves. With trembling hands, Sandra picked it up and noticed her name scrawled uneasily across the front. She opened it, and as her eyes scanned the first lines of shaky handwritten text, iciness gripped her that went far deeper than the winter chill. The letter inside ran 3 full pages, each word meticulously penned but brimming with a thinly veiled menace. The anonymous author demanded a precise sum, $118,000 in cash, directions specifying denominations, and a draconian warning not to contact law enforcement under any circumstance. The threats were explicit. Sandra's daughter Amy was alive and unharmed for now, but any deviation from the instructions, any misstep or appeal for help, would result in fatal consequences. The message was peppered with cryptic phrases about constant surveillance and referenced knowledge of the family's routines, almost as if the writer had been somewhere close, watching them in secret for days. Sandra's heart pounded. The possibility that someone had invaded the security of their home, and now held Amy's life at their mercy, was nearly too much to process. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she called out for Richard, her voice barely recognizable. Within moments, both parents were frantically searching for Amy, calling her name through every room, opening closets and checking under beds, each passing minute feeding the dread that something irreversible had happened. On the kitchen table, Sandra spread the letter, reading through it again and again, looking for hope between the chilling lines, but there was only mounting horror. The fact that the demand matched the exact amount of Richard's Christmas bonus from work only deepened their panic. Someone not just dangerous but alarmingly informed had orchestrated this. Sandra's mind raced with questions. How had they entered? How long had they been watching? Were they in the house still, right now? Despite the explicit threat, the Petersons faced an excruciating choice: obey the letter's command and risk their child's fate, or call for help and draw the wrath the ransom note described. Gritting their teeth and desperate for any hope, Sandra reached for the phone, her hands icy with fear, and dialed 911. Her voice on the emergency line was ragged and urgent, a plea for help on the darkest morning the Petersons, and perhaps all of Boulder, had ever known. Report to the police and initiate an investigation into the disturbance. The shock gripping the Peterson residence had scarcely begun to settle before Sandra, desperately weighing her options, dialed 911 with trembling fingers. Her voice, choked and frantic, relayed to the dispatcher an agonizing summary. Her little girl was missing, and a ransom note had been found. Within minutes, the red and blue lights of police cruisers flashed across the snow-blanketed lawn, casting garish hues on the Christmas decorations, still twinkling from the previous night's celebrations. 2 officers from the Boulder Police Department, Sergeant Ray Donaldson and Officer Mimi Torres, were the first to arrive at 749 Mountain Maple Lane. As they stepped inside, they were greeted by a scene of controlled chaos. Richard and Sandra pacing in the kitchen, relatives whispering anxiously, and young Ben clutching a favorite toy, eyes wide and fearful. Sandra, pale and on the verge of collapse, handed the officers the ominous ransom letter. Donaldson, a veteran with more than 15 Christmases on the force, read it in silence, his jaw tightening at each menacing word. The officers immediately began their initial assessment, methodically cataloging every detail in the Peterson home, alert for anything out of place. They questioned Richard and Sandra about the previous evening, probing for any possible intrusions or strangers who might have shown undue interest in the family. Meanwhile, Officer Torres scoured the house, opening closets, checking the children's bedrooms, peeking into corners where a frightened child might hide. An icy knot grew in her stomach as room after room revealed no sign of Amy. The authorities moved quickly, activating a citywide alert and summoning investigators from the department's major crimes unit. Detective Leonard Briggs, a meticulous man known for his sharp instincts, took charge as neighbors began to gather outside. Scenes of friendly holiday festivity were replaced by a somber tension as word spread. Uniformed officers strung yellow tape around the Peterson property. Forensics teams arrived with evidence kits, snapping photographs of every doorway, collecting fibers from carpets, and dusting heavily for prints, treating the family's cheerful home as a potential crime scene. Yet even in these early moments, mistakes were made. In the confusion, well-meaning friends and relatives continued to enter and exit the house, disturbing possible evidence. The ransom letter was handled by multiple hands, a decision that would haunt the investigation for years. Detectives juggled mounting leads, scrutinizing recent service workers, scanning neighbor security footage, piecing together the Petersons' movements in the hours before Amy vanished. Every so often, Sandra would break down anew, re-explaining the surreal discovery, hoping some missed detail might point police in the right direction. The Boulder police found themselves quickly overwhelmed, unprepared for a crime of this magnitude, especially against the backdrop of a community so unaccustomed to violent acts. Coordination with the FBI began, given the kidnapping angle and the explicit threat embedded in the ransom note. Law enforcement established a makeshift command center nearby, covering phone lines to monitor any possible communication from the kidnappers. Investigators worked to preserve what they could, but the Christmas aftermath left the scene chaotic: discarded wrapping paper, half-eaten cookies, and muddy footprints from dozens of well-wishers layered confusion atop potential clues. Police comforted the Petersons as best they could, but every passing hour without news from the abductors intensified the urgency, and the sense that already crucial opportunities to uncover the truth had begun to slip away. The quest for Amy and for clear answers had only just begun, but the road ahead was growing murkier by the minute. A silent horror, the discovery in the basement. The Peterson house, usually so full of gentle commotion and warmth, had sunk into a chilling quietude by the afternoon of December 26th. As snow continued to swirl against the windows, inside, every moment seemed suspended in a raw, echoing dread. The clock hands inched toward 1 p.m. with no word from Amy's alleged captors. Tension ran like an electric current through every room. Adults whispered fiercely, Radios murmured softly with news of a possible abduction, and police officers, weary yet vigilant, crisscrossed the home with evidence kits and notepads. The festive trappings of the evening before now felt like a cruel joke. Ribbons, opened toys and half-eaten sweets mingled with yellow police tape and muddy boot prints, overlapping joy and terror in jarring surreality. It was Richard who, unable to sit idle a second longer, announced his intent to search the house once again, this time combing every corner, closet, and crawl space. A close family friend joined him, their faces set with quiet determination. The basement had already been briefly checked in the early morning hubbub, but something, perhaps a parent's intuition or mounting desperation, now demanded a more thorough look. Each step down the narrow staircase felt heavier than the last, the wooden treads creaking with the weight of old fears and new uncertainties. Cold from the cement rose up to greet them, stinging their legs through their clothes. The basement was cluttered and domestic. Cardboard boxes stacked from previous holidays, bicycles with deflated tires leaning against the wall, sewing kits, abandoned science fair models, and old winter coats packed in mothballs. The air was dense with the faint odor of dampness and cleaning supplies, but at the very back, tucked behind a heavy storage trunk, was a small utility room, its door shut, a faint draft curling out from underneath. Richard's friend called out softly, as if half expecting Amy to answer. Silence replied. When Richard reached for the doorknob, his hand shook. He fumbled with the light switch. At first the bulb flickered, struggling against the gloom, then slowly illuminated the cramped space. There, on the cold cement floor, bundled awkwardly in a blanket and partially shielded by an overturned box, was the motionless form of Amy Peterson. The next seconds unraveled in a discordant blur, the sharp inhalation, the desperate stumbling cry for help. Even the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Richard dropped to his knees, hands trembling as he reached for his daughter, hoping for warmth, a sign of life, anything. But her skin felt cold, her face, once the very picture of vibrancy, was now pale and almost peaceful in sleep. Yet there was a dark mark at her temple, tape pressed over her mouth, wrists bound loosely against her stomach, horrors too real to be denied or misinterpreted. His anguished yell drew a rush of footsteps above ground. Police, family, and medics thundered down the stairs. Shouts morphed into commands and sobs as the truth became inescapable. In the whirlwind that followed, medics performed their rushed, futile checks while officers roped off the utility room. Richard cradled Amy's hand before ultimately being guided away, swept under by a tidal wave of shock. Sandra, at first confused by the commotion, then petrified, arrived at the foot of the stairs with an expression so stricken it would haunt the onlookers for years. The primal wail that tore from her throat seemed to split the stillness of the entire house. Ben, held back by a neighbor, could not fully understand but sensed with crushing weight that their world would never be the same. Details of the grim discovery quickly took hold. The tape over Amy's mouth prevented any sound. Her pajamas and hair mussed but undisturbed by any obvious struggle. Her favorite comfort doll lay discarded nearby, unceremoniously set aside as though by a distracted hand. Officers tried to observe the scene with sterile professionalism, but the reality tested even the most seasoned among them. No parent, they said later, should ever have to find their child this way. For some, the soft pastel pinks of the blanket, and the cheerful prints on Amy's pajamas, so innocent a day before, became symbols of a shattered innocence the entire nation would soon mourn. Investigators moved to secure the basement and catalog every possible clue. Camera flashes caught glistening tears on cheeks and shone on surfaces previously ignored, a broken window latch nearly hidden by a coat, partially smudged footprints in the dust, fibers sticking to a piece of silver duct tape hastily wadded beneath the water heater. Every detail was scrutinized. Forensics bagged Amy's blanket, her clothing, and the tape with care bordering on reverence, knowing all too well that any mistake here could spell the difference between justice and uncertainty for decades to come. While the professionals worked, the Peterson home filled with the sound of grief, soft crying, the distant drone of police radios, and the hollow, echoing questions that came with tragedy. How could this happen here? Who would do such a thing to a child? The Boulder police chief arrived, his somber presence signaling to everyone inside and out that this was no ordinary crime scene. News quickly reached the front lawn as well, where neighbors and friends had been keeping a quiet vigil, hoping for a miracle. Word spread like wildfire that Amy had been found at home, the nuance of those words lost in a haze of collective heartbreak and disbelief. At the heart of the investigation was the realization that the basement, so ordinary and untouched for years, had become the cruel origin of a nightmare. Rumors would soon swirl about unlocked doors, unidentified footprints, and whether the Petersons had heard anything unusual during the previous night. Amy's discovery there, mere steps below a house full of loved ones and police officers, defied all sense and logic. More chilling still, the ransom note's insistent promise that Amy was safe and would be returned if certain demands were met. The note's author seemed to revel in a macabre game, heightening the sense of confusion and betrayal gripping everyone involved. Nothing about the discovery in the basement fit cleanly into anyone's expectations, least of all the investigators, who now faced a crime scene contaminated by good intentions. Family and searchers had crisscrossed the space, leaving fingerprints and muddy footprints that muddied the evidence both figuratively and literally. Questions arose instantaneously. Had Amy been hidden here all along? Had her abductor snuck back in or ever truly left? How, with all the commotion upstairs, had such horror unfolded so close by, just out of sight and earshot? Law enforcement's first priority became the careful reconstruction of events, a monumental task complicated by the chaos of the day. Forensic teams swept once more for hair, fibers, and any trace DNA that might not belong to a member of the household. Every inch of the basement was mapped and photographed. The coroner's arrival brought with it a hush as Amy's small body was gently wrapped and carried upstairs, past family, police, journalists, and neighbors who parted in silence. The sound of Sandra's second collapse echoed up the stairwell, raw and gutting. Outside, the winter dusk was falling. Headlines had already begun to appear on radio and television. Neighbors streamed down the block, searching for answers in each other's faces and finding only fear. The Peterson home, once the image of suburban warmth, was transformed into a place forever changed, where the echoes of discovery in the basement would never quite leave its walls, or the memories of those who entered that day. Chaotic scene and disastrous mistakes. The Peterson home, which should have remained a sanctuary of warmth and security, transformed that day into a swirling arena of confusion, emotional chaos, and procedural missteps. Like many American families subjected to unimaginable tragedy, the Petersons quickly found themselves surrounded by a throng of well-meaning but disorganized helpers, friends, neighbors, and law enforcement officers. Every detail of those first critical hours would later be scrutinized not only by detectives, but by journalists, legal experts, and armchair investigators nationwide. From almost the moment Amy's body was discovered, the home became a revolving door of grief, shock, and worried faces. Relatives and neighbors continued to arrive, learning the shattering news and searching earnestly for ways to comfort the devastated family. Some brought casseroles, blankets, or toys for Ben in a desperate attempt to create a sense of normalcy. Others simply sat silently on the stairs, overwhelmed by the enormity of loss. Unwittingly, each additional footstep smudged potential prints on the floor and introduced new fibers, thinning any chance of a pristine crime scene. The kitchen, once filled with holiday laughter, now became a makeshift command post. Coffee growing cold on the counter, yellow police tape stretched across the doorways, and rising tension flickering in every whispered argument. Law enforcement's arrival was meant to establish authority and order, but in reality, the Boulder Police Department was simply not prepared for the scale and sensitivity of this investigation. While some officers attempted to secure entry points and limit movement, others, unfamiliar with proper kidnapping or homicide protocols, wavered in their instructions. There was no unified immediate order to seal off the house completely. Family and trusted friends were allowed to move throughout the rooms, many passing around the ransom note out of disbelief or curiosity. At least a half-dozen people potentially left prints or DNA on what would become the single most critical piece of physical evidence. The main staircase and basement entry, pivotal locations, were also contaminated by both those searching for Amy and officers performing hasty sweeps. The forensics teams arrived later than would have been ideal, with Christmas traffic and confusion on radio communications delaying their entrance. By the time they began collecting fibers, photographing rooms, and dusting for prints, the scene had already been significantly altered. Officers, out of habit or misplaced comfort, moved objects in the living room, righted fallen chairs, and replaced a few scattered gifts to give the impression of normalcy for Sandra and Ben. One relative was even seen wiping a spill off the banister, inadvertently erasing what may have been a partial print. The well-intentioned bustle blurred the distinction between guests and evidence, comfort, and contamination. Everywhere, traces of the previous night's celebration mingled with the trappings of emergency, torn wrapping paper pushed aside for evidence technicians, cookies half-eaten and now left to grow stale beneath glaring flashlights, toys tripped over by the first responders. In interviews years later, seasoned detectives would shudder at the memory of how open the initial search had been, how difficult it became to piece together the precise timeline of movements and actions within the house. Several pivotal errors occurred within the first few hours. The ransom letter itself, the centerpiece of the supposed abduction, was handled, examined, and even folded repeatedly by family members, police, and neighbors alike. Gloves were not immediately distributed, and only a cursory effort was made to preserve handwriting evidence or possible skin cell deposits on the envelope and note. Later, forensic analysis would reveal an intermingling of many touch DNA traces, making it nearly impossible to single out a perpetrator or rule out any of those present in the house during those feverish hours. Meanwhile, a lack of centralized command among investigators meant critical questions went unasked, and observations unchecked. The Petersons, in their shock, could not recall exactly when they had last seen Amy Safe, who had been in the house throughout the night, or when various doors had been locked and unlocked. These gaps in memory were not only understandable but almost inevitable under the circumstances, yet they also left crucial blanks that might never be filled. Communications between law enforcement agencies faltered. The Boulder police, unsure whether they were dealing with a kidnapping, a homicide, or some mix of both, allowed jurisdictional confusion to slow the deployment of specialized forensic teams and crime scene analysts. Evidence logs were inconsistent. Recordings of the first frantic interviews, testimonies that might have captured contradictory statements or important clues, were incomplete or muddled by the presence of multiple relatives in earshot. Clutter and personal items remained scattered across key rooms, making it difficult to identify which objects might be connected to the crime versus which belonged to holiday guests. Even when senior officers attempted to assert control, the emotional volatility of the house, Sandra's collapse, Ben's frightened questions, Richard's desperate pacing, continued to break any sense of investigative routine. Outside, as word spread of the tragedy, crowds gathered at the property's edge. Local press, drawn by the horrific possibility of a child murdered in our backyard, began staking out positions on sidewalks and driveways. Some reporters were able to catch glimpses of the interior, and even spoke directly to friends of the family before police cordoned off the perimeter. This influx of outsiders further complicated efforts to preserve external evidence. Footprints in the snow, tire tracks in the driveway, and potential sightings of unknown visitors were all obscured by an ongoing stream of people coming and going. By late afternoon and into the evening, forensic specialists attempted to reconstruct the night's events, mapping possible routes an intruder might have taken in and out of the Peterson home. However, the layered tracks in the snow had become so convoluted that even state crime scene experts struggled to differentiate between those belonging to police, residents, or a potential suspect. The same confusion reigned inside. The possibility that evidence had been picked up, moved, or even disposed of, unintentionally or otherwise, was an unspoken fear among the most experienced officers on scene. One of the most damaging oversights was the lack of a detailed, contemporaneous record. The first photographs of the crime scene were not taken until long after Amy's body had been found, meaning crucial details about the position of objects, the state of doors and windows, and the physical posture of Amy herself could only be recorded after the fact, and after much had been unwittingly altered. Investigators relied on memory, which in a crisis is vulnerable to distortion and inaccuracy. The integrity of what should have been a goldmine of forensic clues became, tragically, a puzzle with many of its pieces scratched, smudged, or lost entirely. As neighbors and relatives returned home, the stories of what they had seen and done inside the Peterson house spread quickly and inconsistently. Some remembered details differently, or in their distress, forgot timelines and actions altogether. Investigators would later find themselves sifting through dozens of conflicting recollections, adding yet another layer of confusion to an already difficult situation. The emotional toll on Sandra and Richard was immense. Their grief was magnified by the guilt of not having known to protect the crime scene, and by the growing realization that small mistakes in these first hours might have changed everything. Looking back, experts would lament that what unfolded in the Peterson household was a textbook case of how not to handle a major crime scene. Each oversight compounded the next, each act of kindness by a neighbor, of comfort by a friend, or of habit by a police officer inadvertently obscured the path to justice. With the scene compromised almost from the outset, the investigation into Amy's murder would face setbacks and doubts for years to come, haunted by the knowledge that the answers might have been right under their nose, if only the chaos could have been kept at bay. In the weeks and months after that terrible day, the shortcomings in those initial hours became a focal point of controversy, spawning legal challenges, internal reviews, and endless debates on cable news and in true crime forums. The Peterson case was cited in national police seminars as a reason for strict scene management training. Some officers resigned or were reassigned. New departmental policies were hastily adopted in Boulder and beyond, mandating immediate lockdowns, better evidence handling, and stricter access control. The Petersons themselves found no comfort in these developments. For them, the heartbreak was compounded by the frustrating sense that closure, if it was to come at all, might forever be out of reach. The chaotic aftermath of the tragedy etched itself into local memory. Police cars lining the block, TV vans illuminating the night with harsh floodlights, friends returning morning after morning to try to piece together the tragic events. To the world outside, the Petersons' Christmas was no longer a time of laughter and warmth, but a symbol of how quickly safety could dissolve into confusion, and how the fight for truth could be undermined by nothing more malevolent than simple human error. The emotional and practical repercussions of that ruined scene would reverberate through every subsequent interview, every frustrated analyst, every journalist still drawn to the case decades later, haunted by the image of a once happy home, now marked by the irreparable scars of both grief and procedural regret. Portrait of the Suspect and the Mysteries. Surrounding the letter, in the weeks that followed the shocking tragedy at the Peterson home, the focus of the investigation shifted sharply toward uncovering the identity of the person or persons behind the mysterious ransom note, an artifact at once chilling, brazen, and maddeningly elusive. The letter's appearance, content, and physical medium presented not just a series of clues, but an entire tapestry of contradictions and questions designed, it seemed, to confound even the most seasoned detectives. From the start, the ransom note was a paradox. Meticulously handwritten on notepaper found within the Peterson house, it was neither haphazard nor professionally typed, but instead felt oddly personal and staged. The penmanship was controlled, yet slightly uneven, suggesting either a hurried hand or a calculated attempt to mimic a disguise. Law enforcement analysts later remarked on the mixture of upper and lowercase letters, frequent grammatical shifts, and the use of unusually formal phrases side by side with awkward slang. To those schooled in forensic linguistics, the message seemed deliberate in its effort to both conceal and reveal, taunting, almost gleeful in its compositional strangeness. Most unsettling was the knowledge that the notepaper itself and the brand of pen were confirmed to have come from a desk drawer inside the Petersons' own study. This detail instantly elevated suspicions that whoever authored it had not only entered the home, but had lingered long enough to rifle through drawers, select materials, and prime the message with an illusion of insider knowledge. Even more confounding was the explicit dollar amount requested, $118,000, a sum that matched Richard Peterson's annual Christmas bonus with haunting precision. This single data point shattered any hope that the event was random. Someone, the family realized, was either close enough to know the minutiae of Peterson's finances or had conducted detailed reconnaissance on their lives. For the Boulder police and collaborating FBI profilers, the note's syntax, vocabulary, and context became ground zero for profiling the suspect. Some investigators were convinced by the peculiar mixture of bravado and familiarity in the phrasing that the author might be someone close to the family, a neighbor, friend, or even, in the darkest suspicions, a family member. The inclusion of phrases like, "don't try to grow a brain," or specific warnings not to involve law enforcement suggested a writer steeped in American crime drama cliches, possibly attempting to embed red herrings and muddy the waters. Experts pored over letter formation and idiosyncratic word choices, hoping to connect it to school or work samples from those in the Petersons' orbit. Meanwhile, another school of thought seized on the oddities of the note's grammar, awkward sentence structures, abnormal verb tenses, idioms that seemed out of place for a native English speaker. Was this a deliberate attempt to disguise the author's identity, perhaps by mimicking someone whose first language was not English? Or was the writer simply attempting to throw authorities off track by faking a linguistic background? Forensic linguistic analysis could only do so much, and the more they analyzed, the more divisive the expert opinions became. The most persistent question continued to hover: Was the note composed before the crime, or drafted ad hoc once inside the house? The length of the message, nearly 3 pages, argued against the speed and surreptitiousness required of an outside intruder who would risk so much time in a house full of people. Or, even more chilling, was the writer someone residing within, with both access and opportunity to draft such a message without concern? Handwriting analysts combed through the family's personal correspondence, all school assignments, and even the scribblings on shopping lists pinned to the fridge, scouring for matches. Neighbors and close friends were discreetly asked to produce writing samples under seemingly innocent circumstances. But the result was only a growing sense of frustration. As the days passed, no clear match emerged, only possibilities tantalizingly close, yet never conclusive. Outside the immediate circle of suspicion, detectives reviewed the family's recent activities, scrutinizing everyone with access to sensitive financial information. Richard's company accountant was interviewed at length, as were staff members at the children's school, members of the local church, and seemingly innocuous figures like delivery drivers or gardeners who had regular access to the Peterson property. No one escaped the widening web of inquiry. Family friends who had attended Christmas celebrations found themselves questioned about overheard conversations regarding Richard's bonus or household routines. Rumors spread through Boulder's usually tight-knit community, fracturing social bonds and sparking whispered accusations. Meanwhile, the press, ravenous for a breakthrough in the case, published theories daily, each new analysis dissecting the motives behind every line of the note. As the letter itself was analyzed for physical evidence, forensic teams examined fibers, skin cells, and prints. Yet here, too, complications multiplied. In the chaos following Amy's disappearance, the note had been handled by multiple members of the household and even a responding officer, blurring any clear DNA profile. Glove use had been spotty, and the envelope itself bore overlapping partial prints. FBI behavioral analysts weighed in, suggesting the author might be narcissistic, enjoying the spectacle and control as much as the monetary reward. Others wondered if the peculiarity of the sum and the manner of phrasing revealed the inside job bent. Only someone desperate, perhaps, or seeking to stage an outsider narrative would create such a deeply conflicted script. Had an outsider really snuck in undetected, or could all these clues, absurd as they seemed, be camouflage for a far more intimate betrayal? As the weeks turned to months, the ransom note remained a symbol both of hope that some pattern might finally emerge to point to the culprit, and of despair, as every new theory seemed to shatter under the weight of doubt and evidence compromised by early mishandling. The Peterson case grew infamous among law enforcement circles, not only for its tragedy, but for the singular, confounding cipher that one letter came to represent. Every piece of information about that note was scrutinized, every smudge, every flourish of the pen, every oddly capitalized word dissected, yet the enigmatic author, whoever they were, remained, as ever, just beyond the reach of certainty. Conflicting investigation directions and suspicions from minor details. The investigation into Amy Peterson's tragic death quickly split down irreconcilable lines, with police, experts, media, and even ordinary citizens taking sides regarding what precisely had transpired and who might be responsible. From the very first hours, the questions floating through the detectives' war room were as contradictory as they were haunting. Did the perpetrator come from inside the family's trusted circle, or was an opportunistic intruder stalking a house that, on Christmas night, seemed so safe? The stakes were elevated by a constant drumbeat of minute details, each examined and re-examined for what they hinted at about the killer's identity and method. At the crux of the inquiry was the DNA evidence. Traces found on Amy's clothing and the fibers recovered from the basement utility room. Forensic analysts discovered genetic material that did not match any member of the Peterson family or known close associates. To some detectives, this seemed like the smoking gun proof of an unknown assailant, likely someone who had secretly entered the home under the cover of night. The presence of a partial boot print in dust near the utility closet, unmatched by the shoes catalogued from household members and guests, only deepened the belief in a stranger's involvement. Yet, for every piece of evidence pointing to an external suspect, there were unexplained inconsistencies within the Peterson household itself. Interview records showed discrepancies in recounting timelines, with small but mounting contradictions in statements from Richard and Sandra about when the alarm had been set, which doors were locked, and who last checked on Amy before bed. Ben, the older brother, gave a nervous account that didn't always line up with his parents' memory of the night's events, further muddying the narrative. Some investigators wondered if fear or trauma was distorting their recollections, or if something was being deliberately withheld. Analysts scrutinized the ransom note, obsessed with its peculiar mix of insider knowledge and staged dramatic flair. The exact amount of $118,000 demanded betrayed a familiarity with Richard's annual bonus, while linguistic quirks suggested either a crude attempt at obfuscation or a trace of genuine inexperience with American idioms. Handwriting experts failed to match the writing conclusively to anyone within the Peterson circle or beyond, intensifying suspicions of either masterful disguise or a subtle familial link. Every minute anomaly became fuel for clashing theories. The unlocked basement window, a possible ingress route, bore no clear tool marks but had a latch loosely askew, hinting at either a deft intruder or a household member covering tracks. The curious placement of Amy's comfort doll just outside the utility room haunted everyone. Was it dropped in panic by a stranger, or positioned by someone who knew precisely what would tug at the heartstrings of a searching family? The hurried, almost ritualistic binding and taping suggested both a practiced efficiency and an unsettling awareness of how such acts would be interpreted by law enforcement. The investigative divide soon spread beyond the local precinct. As the media caught wind of the contradictory signals, outside experts voiced their opinions, some insisting that statistics showed most child abductions and murders were committed by family or individuals known to the victim, while others cited rare but devastating stranger danger incidents as cautionary precedents. The FBI's behavioral unit weighed in with profiles, debating whether the letter's tone and the crime's bizarre mixture of calculation and recklessness fit the pattern of a family annihilator, a ransom-minded extortionist, or an unbalanced outsider seeking notoriety. Scrutiny turned to every small irregularity. Detectives dwelled on the timing of phone calls, who handled the ransom note and when, and the fleeting evidence in the muddy snow, tracks that appeared at first to lead nowhere. Each potential clue seemed both tantalizing and inconclusive. A neighbor's report of a suspicious van idling on the street clashed with the absence of surveillance video. A failed attempt to lift a readable fingerprint from the note's smooth, paper-stymied momentum. Meanwhile, tension grew within the investigation, with some officers convinced that cracks were showing in the Peterson family's united front. Why had Richard and Sandra hesitated, if only briefly, before calling 911? How had so many visitors passed through the house in the crucial hours after Amy was reported missing? Could the disorder of the scene have been mere chaos? Or was it a conscious effort to hide something darker? On the other hand, those wary of implicating the grieving family countered that such suspicion arose precisely because the alternative, an unknown individual lurking within a peaceful neighborhood, was too chilling for Boulder or America at large to accept. They pointed to the risk an outsider would face, entering and exiting a busy home undetected, and how the very sloppiness of the crime scene could as easily reflect panic and heartbreak as calculated deceit. The absence of a clear suspect intensified efforts to re-examine every scrap of material evidence, each family interview, every community tip relayed to the anonymous hotline. As weeks moved on and breakthroughs remained elusive, the contradictory leads only multiplied. DNA samples suggested an external threat, but behavioral patterns fueled suspicion close to home. The very details that might have illuminated the case, the broken window, the carefully composed ransom note, the hesitations in memory during interviews, all instead tangled the investigation in deeper uncertainty and division. In the end, the truth behind those small, shadowed anomalies became almost as shrouded in mystery as the crime itself, leaving a town and a nation to wonder, had the answers ever been hiding in plain sight, or had they slipped through the cracks in a case defined by contradiction? Public opinion erupts, U.S. media abuzz with excitement. The Peterson case erupted into the fabric of American consciousness almost overnight, transforming what was once a quiet family tragedy into a national spectacle fraught with rumor, debate, and mounting societal anxiety. From the moment news outlets caught wind of a child's murder in the sanctuary of her home, during the supposed innocence of Christmas, media vans and satellite trucks descended upon Boulder with breathtaking speed. Headline writers scrambled for superlatives, labeling the case the Boulder Christmas Nightmare, while 24-hour news cycles fed on every rumor, discrepancy, or emotional outburst from those connected to the investigation. Morning talk shows, hungry for content and public outrage, brought in criminal profilers, handwriting experts, and even body language analysts to scrutinize every televised interview of the Peterson family. Internet forums, newly vibrant in the late 1990s, erupted with amateur sleuths dissecting timelines, theorizing about hidden family secrets, and tossing out accusations with impunity. Mainstream papers ran exposés delving into the family's finances, the competitive world of children's pageantry, and even tangential stories about past crimes in Boulder, all in an attempt to fit the Peterson case into a broader narrative of American fears and obsessions. No detail seemed too personal or insignificant for public consumption. Old photos of Amy's pageant performances were splashed across front pages alongside images of Richard and Sandra Peterson, each facial expression parsed for hidden guilt or sorrow. Ben, Amy's older brother, became a figure of fascination and occasionally suspicion in the darkest corners of public speculation. Neighbors and teachers' offhand comments were quoted as evidence for or against various theories, stoking fires of speculation and fueling endless talk show segments. The police force, unaccustomed to such intense national scrutiny, found themselves not only battling the complexity of the case but also the glare of relentless public attention. Officers complained anonymously of sleepless nights, of phone lines jammed by tips from across the country, most well-intentioned, some fanciful, and more than a few malicious. The department began to fracture under competing pressures: the demand for swift justice from a horrified nation, the necessity for methodical investigation, and the constant threat that any misstep would be broadcast, analyzed, and critiqued on prime time. Meanwhile, high-profile legal analysts and TV personalities swarmed Boulder, setting up makeshift studios on snowy sidewalks and casting a carnival-like atmosphere around the Peterson residence. Each new press conference drew camera crews from across the states, their satellite dishes punctuating the horizon, their microphones thrust toward police spokespeople and grieving family members alike. The story ballooned, taking on a life of its own, one in which cold facts competed with emotional testimonies and rampant speculation for the nation's attention. Public reaction ran the gamut from profound sympathy for Sandra, Richard, and Ben, to spiraling suspicion and, at times, shocking hostility. Some broadcast commentators questioned the family's emotional displays. Was Sandra's crying genuine or performative? Did Richard's composure mask guilt? Psychological experts were invited to dissect home videos, family interviews, and even courtroom sketches, prompting headlines with thinly veiled accusations. Letter to the editor columns and radio call-in shows overflowed with polarized opinions. In some quarters, Amy was transformed from victim to a symbol. Of innocence lost, of the pressure on girls in beauty pageants, or of the hidden dangers lurking even in affluent neighborhoods. Others began to blame the parents and police department for, in their view, endangering Amy through their choices or mishandling the investigation. Boulder, once synonymous with idyllic Colorado mountain living, became a shorthand for suburban vulnerability and media-driven hysteria. The discussion spilled onto the national stage as pundits drew comparisons between the Peterson case and previous American crimes that had seized the collective consciousness. Shows like America's Most Wanted and Dateline NBC aired special episodes reconstructing the Christmas timeline with dramatic reenactments, ominous music, and expert interviews. Nancy Grace-style coverage transformed Amy's image into a martyr, her smile an emblem on posters, her name a rallying cry during heated debates on cable news. The internet, still a developing force, proved to be both a blessing and a curse. Newsgroups and burgeoning websites devoted to the Peterson mystery thrived. A digital grapevine spun wild with rumors, leaked police documents, and purported photographs of evidence. Amateur detectives crafted elaborate Reddit threads and tripod websites, complete with timelines, suspect charts, and speculative motives. False leads, conspiracy theories, and even doctored evidence spread quickly, muddying public understanding and complicating the job of official investigators. The Peterson family's privacy evaporated under this intense media glare. They became prisoners in their own home, family friends were hounded by reporters and in some cases, even followed to work or church for comment. Small-town routines were upended as Boulder locals found themselves cast as either potential suspects or background characters in a nationwide drama. Local businesses saw both a boom from out-of-town visitors and journalists, and a backlash from regulars frustrated by the intrusion and constant spectacle. Even the language of the case bled into American cultural shorthand. Late-night comedians made pointed, sometimes tasteless, jokes at the family's expense. Novelists and screenwriters mused openly about adapting the mere suggestion of the Peterson tragedy for true crime books and primetime miniseries. The phrase Peterson Christmas became code for disaster befalling in idyllic settings, a mix of horror and heartbreak that refused to fade from national memory. Over months and years, the Peterson case remained a touchstone for discussions about parenting, policing, and media responsibility. Pundits and advocates called for reforms, ranging from greater oversight of law enforcement to ethical codes for tabloid journalism, and even the regulation of online speculation in high-profile cases. Some family supporters eventually sued media outlets for libel or harassment, but the damage to privacy and public trust had largely been done. For the American public, the case of Amy Peterson marked a turning point. No longer could any tragedy, however intimate, be contained to a private circle of grief. From now on, all such events would be played out under the microscope of a restless, sometimes ravenous national audience. The story's lessons, about the dangers of rush to judgment, about the power and peril of the media, and about the wounds left by suspicion and sensationalism, would echo in American discourse long after the last TV truck had left Boulder's snowy streets. 2 decades later, an endless ache that won't heal. Nearly 28 years have passed since the bitterly cold Christmas that forever altered the Peterson family and the town of Boulder. Yet, as each December returns, snow dusting the Rockies, carols wafting through the air, lights blinking from frosted eaves, a sense of unresolved ache permeates every reflection on the tragedy. The house itself stands much as it did that winter night, 2 stories of brick and timber, its windows looking out over quiet tree-lined streets. But gone are the wreaths and welcoming glow. Instead, shutters are tightly drawn. Current residents unrelated to the Petersons refer to it as that house, seldom mentioning it by address. Neighbors tread quietly past, casting furtive glances. Even the bravest children avoid its front walk during Halloween. In Boulder and for many across the country, the Peterson home has become a haunted landmark, less for ghosts than for the lingering question of truth never told. For Richard and Sandra Peterson, the weight of their loss did not grow lighter with time, only more intricately woven into the fabric of their days. Sandra, once the warm and effervescent social center of her neighborhood, retreated from public life, her laughter reduced to little more than a memory. She took solace in outreach work, speaking to families affected by violence, counseling grieving parents, but every holiday, every birthday, hammered home the space Amy left behind. Richard, who tried to sublimate his grief through relentless work, finally stepped down from his position, certain he could never return to the world as it had been. Ben grew into adulthood beneath a pall others could neither see nor measure, carrying forward a legacy of both scrutiny and sympathy that shaped every relationship he formed. Media attention never fully faded. Every few years, on round-number anniversaries or the rare emergence of a new tip, reporters once more descend on Boulder. Television crews retrace the family's footsteps through grainy footage. National magazines remember the case in retrospectives. Social media, in recent years, has ensured the debate never fully quiets. Each time, online forums reignite uneasy speculation. Was the crime committed by a cunning outsider, or did someone inside the house orchestrate a perfect deception? Did the answer lie in overlooked evidence, or was it simply swept away by the chaos and pain of those first few hours? The persistence of these questions, and the bitterness of their tone, often reopens old wounds for everyone closest to Amy's memory. Efforts to revive public interest in the case found varying results. Advocacy groups used Amy's story to argue for reforms in evidence handling and victim support. Local charities organized runs and candlelight vigils, rites that provided fleeting comfort but no real closure. T-shirts bearing Amy's image, once meant to raise reward money, became bittersweet souvenirs in closets across several states. Law enforcement, meanwhile, saw no end to occasional criticism. Older detectives, retired but still uneasy, wondered aloud whether a crucial lead had been missed. New officers, assigned to cold case squads, pored with fresh eyes over boxes of files, hoping to see patterns missed in the scramble of 1996. More than once, technology brought hope. New DNA techniques, advanced forensic software, AI reconstructions of witness memory. Each breakthrough came with promise, yet ended in disappointment. The partial genetic profile found on Amy's clothing yielded no hit in any database, and the pool of possible suspects was never convincingly narrowed. Interpersonal relationships among those involved frayed under the weight of suspicion and regret. Some of the Petersons' closest friends, once allies in grief, moved away, frustrated by relentless press attention or by the painful uncertainty woven through every post-tragedy interaction. At family reunions or church events, awkward silences multiplied. Even the most well-meaning comfort could not dispel the shadow the case left behind. Rumors occasionally still erupted into the open, shattering attempts at normalcy. The sense of betrayal, not just by whoever was responsible, but by the system meant to protect families like the Petersons, grew increasingly raw with each passing season. The town of Boulder itself, so proud for so long of its peaceful reputation, found it difficult to reconcile that ideal with national notoriety. Tourism literature quietly omitted mention of the case, though true crime enthusiasts still drove by for photographs. Civic leaders eager to move forward struggled to provide comfort or closure. Sometimes they would hold moments of silence. At other times, city council meetings devolved into blame-laying about local law enforcement's hard lessons learned too late. Several officers who had worked the scene went on to teach seminars about what not to do, an irony they carried with weary resignation. Despite the lack of resolution, some good did emerge, though it always seemed inadequate. Boulder's emergency response protocols were overhauled. National standards on evidence handling, family notification, and victim advocacy were tightened. School curriculum throughout Colorado included gentle discussion of trauma and resilience, often referencing the Peterson case as a why not how. The Petersons, though irreparably changed, often chose, when approached, to remind people of Amy's spirit, insisting her legacy was not simply tragedy, but also the capacity for hope, change, and compassion her memory inspired. Yet the ache does not fade. For those at the center of the story, and for a country obsessed with answers, every anniversary, every snowy December, every time a new family decorates a Christmas tree in Boulder, the questions return: how could this happen? Could it happen again? Who is still out there, with secrets too heavy to reveal? The truth about Amy's final night remains elusive, beyond the reach of justice and the grasp of closure. And so, in the cold shadow of the Rockies, the echo of her absence lingers, an ache that, 2 decades on, neither time nor reason nor justice can quite dispel.